Anyway, Gabriel's new book is called Climbing the Charts. It's coming out this summer at Princeton University Press, and he's going to talk about one of those chapters. So,
yeah. Thank you. Well, I won't be showing due humility and thanking everybody I got advice from on this. I'll just be presenting the research so you don't have to play the music to get me to walk off the stage. So the Dixie Chicks thing is actually Chapter 5 in this, but I'm going to be presenting Chapter 4 from the book. And part of the reason that I was interested in radio is just because it's intrinsically interesting. It's just a fun subject, talk about pop music and what have you. But the main reason that I'm interested in it is that there's really, really high-quality data where you can basically perfectly observe behavior in the field for the last 8 years or so. And by doing that, you can get at lots of general issues in diffusion of innovation, social networks, etc. And there's lots of high-quality data, there's almost perfect observation, and there's just like a bottomless pit of new innovations. Basically, every Tuesday, the record labels back up a truck and release a bunch of new singles, each one of which is a new innovation. So you compare that to the usual econ-soc thing of people who like to copy old phone books into Excel, and it takes you 4 years to make a data set, so you only have a single innovation. You can ask qualitatively different types of questions when you have basically a bottomless pit of diffusion data to look at. So it's almost like a fruit fly for innovation. So even if you don't especially care about radio in of itself, you can use it just as your little model organism for getting at general problems in diffusion of innovation. So you can learn a lot by reading the qualitative and trade literature. And one of my favorite trade books on pop music is the memoir of Jacob Schlichter, the drummer from the one-hit wonder band Semisonic. And the reason I like this book is not because I especially think that, the highlight of pop music was their one-hit wonder song, Closing Time. But it's a good song, but, not necessarily worth talking about 12 years after the fact. But the reason is because he goes into this, a lot of discussion about what it was like to become a pop star. And there's an enormous amount of detail about negotiating record contracts, promoting the song on radio, that sort of stuff. So it's kind of like a memoir that speaks to the kind of concerns of production of culture types. So there's this one particular passage in that where he says, K-Rock is adding the single. This is like the opening drop quote at the beginning of a chapter. And it was Jim, Semisonic's manager, savoring my disbelief at such spectacular news. To be added to the playlist of Los Angeles-based K-Rock is to be anointed by the ruling superpower of alternative rock radio. This was a resounding endorsement, one that would reverberate throughout the world of radio. So basically, this particular rock musician is absolutely convinced that one station sets the example for the whole field, right? There's a single station that is the agenda setter, and that by taking this, almost like a Schwerpunkt, right, you can take over the entire field. And you may recognize this if you do diffusion or networks. You may recognize this as just a special case of the opinion leadership hypothesis. The idea that there's certain people who are core to social networks and control what ideas diffuse through the social networks. The opinion leader hypothesis was developed in a series of studies at Columbia in the 40s and 50s. Originally, Lazarsfeld did a study of electoral politics and observed the two-step flow model, where people didn't necessarily learn about political ideas directly from the news media, but some people did, and they tended to talk to other people about these ideas and spread these ideas to them. And then later, Katz and Lazarsfeld replicated it in a series of studies, and they found that you had similar things going on with fashion, movies, other different types of tastes. You had a certain amount of asset specificity for the opinion leaders. Over time, not necessarily in that original study, but over time, the idea of opinion leaders became associated with network centrality. And this is especially the case in Coleman, Katz, and Mendel's tetracycline/gamamine study. And they studied when doctors started prescribing tetracycline as a function of their social network. So they went to these 4 small towns in the Midwest, and they interviewed all these doctors saying, who do you get advice from? And then they went to the pharmacy records, looked at when they first prescribed this new antibiotic called tetracycline. An equally important study in the development of this idea was Milgram's study of Nebraskans reaching Bostonians via network search. There were 2 major findings from this. One was 6 degrees of separation. Most of the completed change from Nebraska to Boston had an average path length of 6. Although actually, if you model censorship from the truncation of the uncompleted chains, it's probably more like 8, but people don't talk about 8 degrees of separation. There wasn't a Will Smith movie called 8 Degrees of Separation, so we can just stick with calling it 6. And then the other, actually more interesting one in a certain way, is that of the completed chains, a very high proportion of them pass through a few people. There were several completed chains that passed through a few people, and this is where we get the idea that hubs have a disproportionate influence on the network. And these people were called different things. We now would tend to call them network hubs. You could just call them high centrality actors. I think the original study called them sociometric stars. But basically these are the opinion leaders. Fast forward 40 years, and this idea was popularized by Malcolm Gladwell in a series of New Yorker articles and also his book, The Tipping Point. And the book covers a lot of ideas that were, more or less state-of-the-art at the time that Gladwell was writing the book, although, as we'll see, some of them have been superseded by research since 2000, in social networks and complexity theory. And the core idea that Gladwell's getting across in this book is that network hubs are opinion leaders, and that this has the practical implication that if you want to spread something through society, you have to identify these network hubs and somehow co-opt them, and then they will spread it through the social system for you. So not only was the book a huge bestseller that's still available in airports everywhere, my wife actually needed a copy of this, and she's like, we need to go to the airport and buy a copy. But Gladwell has also become something of a business guru who's grown fabulously wealthy on speaking fees, and it seems to have changed the way business works in that sense it was performative. So shortly after the tipping point, you saw the kind of the viral marketing business fad, which in many ways is still going, and especially with the rise of social media. So for instance, here's an illustration of how it's become performative. This is a patent filing from Microsoft that describes how a company can increase overall sales by identifying network hubs and offering them discounts, and it kind of figures out if this guy has a certain level of centrality in the network, and you figure out you give something cheap that'll spread, and you'll get a partial effect that rebounds, so it pays for the discount. So basically it's an estimate based on people's centrality, how much of a discount should you offer them in order to get the money back.
Has anyone contested that patent?
Yeah, it seems like we'd have prior art in this building, right? So, or possibly downstairs from me at Phil Bonasich's office. Actually, there's another thing kind of like that you guys may have heard. Yahoo, kind of going through its death throes, is turning into a patent troll, and it sued Facebook. And one of the patents that it's suing Facebook on is it claims that it owns the entire concept of a computer-mediated social network. So it seems like you should just direct them to the AJS listing in JSTOR and claim prior art. So another way that you see this is with the company Clout, which provides Twitter analytics, and businesses use Clout to identify people who are highly central to networks, particularly, especially the Twitter network, and give them free or discounted products. So, for instance, when Virgin America launched a new route to Toronto, it consulted with Clout to identify 120 so-called opinion leaders and give them free flights to Toronto, with the idea being that they'd then tweet about what a fantastic flight it was and convince other people to pay full fare to fly to Toronto. Now, you can always tell when a piece of information is important to markets because people start complaining about it. Here in academia, we complain about the SAT. Why? Because the SAT is important. If nobody cared about the SAT, nobody would complain about it. And in media, they complain about audience metrics. There's a long and proud tradition of complaining about Nielsen ratings, which is how you can tell that Nielsen ratings are important. Similarly, now in advertising markets, they're starting to complain about Clout. Here's an article that was published in Ad Age, which we're not going to read aloud, but I can just sum up for you. The short version is, this person doesn't understand how network centrality works. That's basically the gist of the article. So the interesting thing is the very fact that this person is complaining about it shows that they accept the basic concept. They just don't understand the implementation, right? They accept the basic premise that there is such a thing as an opinion leader and there should be ways to identify them. They're just saying that there's a certain opacity or unfairness about the particular way it's implemented. Okay, of course we can ask, is it true? And we recently have some reasons to suspect it may not be. Dodds and Watts published a piece about 5 years ago in Journal of Consumer Research where they did a series of network simulations. And they simulated random networks as seen in the top. And the interesting thing about random networks is the distribution of degree follows roughly a Poisson. And then they also estimated scale-free networks or preferential attachment networks, as shown on the bottom. And those you have a scale-free or power law distribution for. And I know people have been complaining about power laws. Let's just say approximately power law distribution for degree in those. And basically what they showed in this article is that preferential attachment is a scope condition for opinion leadership. You can't have opinion leadership unless you have preferential attachment networks. And they, to a certain extent, were selling this as saying that, therefore, opinion leadership doesn't work. But this doesn't actually bother me that much because, preferential attachment networks are common. We know lots of networks that actually look like that. So I don't see that as a seriously disqualifying scope condition. It is a scope condition, but it's one that's often met. Okay.
So what is a preferential attachment network?
It's one where the network formation process is that new nodes entering the network, the probability of forming a link with an extant node is proportional to the in degree that node already has. So basically, I walk into the room, I'm trying to figure out who to become friends with. I go for the person who's already the most popular.
Right.
Yeah. And when you have that structural formation process, you get something that looks like this. It looks kind of like a tree if we were to rearrange it. Okay, so now, in general, we have some reason to expect that network hubs will become opinion leaders, but also some reason to doubt it. Getting back to radio, we have industry folk wisdom for the opinion leader hypothesis, but we can still ask if it's true. Okay, so I did a survey. So I already mentioned that I have all this data on what the radio stations do, so I have a lot of data on their behavior, but we need the structure in order to pull it out. And so I did a sociometric survey, just interviewed, I think I ended up talking to about 2/3 of all top 40 stations in the United States, commercial top 40 stations in the United States, and interviewed them, basically just asked, what other stations do you pay attention to? I asked the question a few ways, but I ultimately reduced it down to if they listen to that station, like driving on their car on the way to work, if they personally communicate with, if they follow them in the trade magazines, basically if they have any other way, if they have any way of knowing what's going on with this other station, that counts. And if you look at it, it has a pretty power law-like distribution for degree. This is WHTZ-FM in New York. This is KISS-FM in Los Angeles. The other, you might think based on that this would be Chicago or whatever, but it doesn't perfectly follow the size of the metro. It's pretty highly correlated with the size of the metro, but not perfectly. So anyway, so we have this thing where we have two phenomenally popular stations. 1/3 of all stations who name anybody, basically 1/3 of stations name one of them, right? So you have and then you have a very large number of stations who aren't nominated by a single alter. So we do have the kind of preferential attachment network that is assumed that Watson-Strogatz identified as a scope condition. So that's good, right? But remember, the opinion leadership hypothesis is not synonymous with the preferential attachment hypothesis. That's a scope condition. We still need to ask, do these people actually matter? And so we can derive from Rogers. Rogers likes to talk about... Rogers doesn't like to use event history analysis. He likes to basically draw the diffusion curve, which he assumes is always normally distributed, instantaneous, and always an S-curve when cumulative. And then he cuts into chunks based on sigmas. And he draws these like ideotypical type things where he says, here's the innovators, the people who are the very first to do it. These people don't care, don't matter. They're too crazy. And then here's the early adopters. These are Rogers' favorite people. He loves to talk about the early adopters. And those are the people he thinks are especially key. They're the people between -2 and -1 sigmas by adoption time. And one of his predictions is that they're at the core of the social network. So here's this example of like a study of a new type of herbicide. And the very first person to do it was this guy who learned about it directly from the chemist who invented it. But this guy is so weird. He's out there talking to chemists that none of the other farmers like him. So the fact that he does it doesn't cause it to spread. It's only when the only person who does talk to him is Mr. Popular, who's willing to talk to everybody. He learns about the herbicide from, kind of crackpotty guy. And now that Mr. Popular does it, every farmer in town just can't wait to spray this on all their weeds. And so basically from Rogers we can get this prediction that you should tend to see people with very high centrality adopting kind of in this between -2 and -1 sigmas of adoption time. So basically, we would expect their adoption times on average to be not all the way in the left, but appreciably to the left. And we can plot that. I took a couple hundred songs, looked at the average adoption time by station, averaged it out, and I plotted a scatter plot against the number of nominations they received. And according to Rogers, the people on the right side of the graph should all be in this yellow band. As you can see, there's no correlation whatsoever. The two most popular people are basically right at the median. And then the other people, it's just kind of random. There's no association here. So why is this? Well, part of the reason that it's like this is because your typical...
This is adoption of what?
I'm sorry, this is adoption of pop songs. So this is the first time they play particular pop songs. And then I just averaged this over a couple hundred pop songs to see what their average... So basically, let's say I'm Kiss FM, very popular station, one of the most respected top 40 stations in the country. Do I tend to play songs a little bit before or a little bit later than everybody else? And it turns out that Kiss plays them slightly before average, but not basically right on time. Yeah. Okay, so why is this? Why isn't there the correlation that Rogers tells us we should expect? Well, part of the reason is that your typical hit song diffuses like this. This is Umbrella by Rihanna. And as you can see here, this song just spread almost immediately across radio. In fact, you can't see it that clearly on this graph, but 22% of all top 40 stations played this on the day it was released. Now, if they're all playing it on the day, if 22% of people were playing on the day it was released, it's not like they're minute to minute, keeping track of what their rivals are doing, right? It's just too fast for them to be learning from each other. They have to be learning about it from some central source. As I explained in some of the other chapters of the book, it turns out that they're learning about it from the record label. A lot of people believe that they're learning about it from corporate headquarters, but I show that's not the case. They're actually learning about it from the record labels. So, but the point is that this is the typical style of diffusion of the song. Now, the opinion leadership hypothesis is a special case of endogenous diffusion, right? There's other forms of endogenous diffusion, including unstructured threshold models, like we see in Granovetter 78, but there's not... but this isn't one of them, right? This is an external influence curve. This is something that's only consistent with something spreading from outside the system onto the system. This is Achilles and the tortoise. And if people are learning about something from each other, you don't see Achilles and the tortoise. You see an S-curve. We don't see an S-curve, so it doesn't happen, right? So basically, diffusion is overspecified by this external process, and so you simply can't have opinion leadership hypothesis because it just doesn't fall in the right class. So it's overspecified by this. So, in some ways, we're not setting a fair test for opinion leadership because we should be saying, well, this should be something that does spread endogenously, does spread by word of mouth. Then if it spreads by word of mouth, we could say maybe there's a special role for people who know a lot of people, right? That's assumed by the theory. Let's be fair to it. So to give it a favorable test, we'd need to find a song that the record label didn't market, but nonetheless became a hit. And we actually have such a song with My Humps by Black Eyed Peas. This is the cover of the single. This picture right here is the cover of the single. But this single was actually released after the song became a hit. The radio station started playing the song even without there being a single. And the reason that the record label did not initially release the single is because the song is awful. I mean, it's like unbelievably awful. And if anyone doubts the veracity of my scientific assessments, I can play it in Q&A. I have it all queued up. But I went through and looked at what newspaper critics were saying about the song on the day the album was released. One said it was an interminable paean to female member Fergie's hind and front quarters. Another said a massive clunker. Another said one of the most embarrassing rap performances in the new millennium. Asinine, laughably bad, abysmal. Right, so the rock critics, the pop critics thought that this was a terrible song. The record label seems to be thinking similar things. And yet, nonetheless, it became a huge hit. So the original plan that the record label had was to... so standard operating procedure for promoting a major record release is you come out with one single, your best single, 2 months before the record hits stores. You come out with another single around the day the record drops, and then you come out with another single 2 months after that. So you have a staggered release of 3 singles. In the case of Black Eyed Peas' album for this, the songs were "Don't Funk With My Heart, Don't Lie and Pump It," which are shown in blue, red, and yellow. And you'll see that these basically have the kind of convex curve similar to what we saw earlier for Rihanna's Umbrella. And then we also see this green curve. Hey, that's an S-curve. We're sociologists. We love S-curves, right? This is our favorite curve as our discipline. And so that's an indication that this song spread endogenously. And in fact, we know from the trade history that this song spread endogenously because nobody was promoting it. So the only way it could have spread was endogenously. If nobody's promoting it, it can't spread endogenously. So this is a favorable case. And we can look to see, because this song spread endogenously, maybe it was spread by the hubs. Right? Maybe the hubs were the ones who pushed this song, and so we can look at that network graph again. And if it is spread by the hubs, we'd expect to see it spreading like an ink blot across the graph. Right? It may start randomly at some point in the graph, but then it should spread like an ink blot across the graph. And if we look, here, I'll show you again. It just appears at random points in the graph. We can look at that a little more slowly. Here's the first time it got played. Right? It's basically appearing at random points in the graph. We can see the same thing in discrete time event history. Now, what most people would do, the way a lot of people do things is they look at, you very often find effects for contagion. Like the typical thing is you look and say, how many times your friends play this, but then you don't control for how popular was it overall. If you do just this line, the number of alters that are playing it, you end up getting an effect. But that's just because your alters are basically a random sample, well, not purely random sample, but a basically random sample of the field overall. And it turns out what really matters is how many people in the field overall were playing it. And so I think it's very important, there's kind of a general lesson for this, is that if you're doing a thing where you're looking at how many of your alters do something, you're trying to predict it, you need to also control for the baseline. And you may find that the alters dropped out, because sometimes we're more attentive to that. Anyway, but if you look at it, you see that how many people are playing it overall is a pretty strong determinant, right? So there is endogenous diffusion, but it's at the field level. It's at the overall level of what is everybody doing who's a member of our field, who's a member of our category, rather than what are the particular people that we happen to know doing. Now, why would it be that an actor might be more attentive to its peers overall than to a particular alter?
Explain again with an alter, how you...
Oh, it's defined as people who named each other in a survey. Yeah, that's right. Well, a radio station wanting to know what's popular in general just has to read Billboard, right? This is a highly salient piece of information for radio stations. When I interview the radio stations, they were willing to tell me, oh yeah, I pay attention to this station, that station, the other station. I also asked them, how much attention do you pay to the chart? Almost all of them said strongly agree, right? They almost all I pay a lot of attention to the chart. The chart's very important. In one of the early qualitative interviews when I was kind of developing the survey instrument, one of the programmers I talked to said the chart is God, right? Probably a little bit of exaggeration, but nonetheless, it is a salient piece of information. This comes across, it's very easy to understand, comes at the programmers. In contrast, if they wanted to find out what their particular alters were doing, they'd need to construct a custom query in the database. Most of them aren't good enough at computers to do that. It's not even clear that they'd want to. Or they'd have to talk to them, right? For instance, I have a very good idea of, and this is not a terribly uncommon thing, I have a very good idea of what the number one movie in America was last weekend. I probably have a better idea of that than I do of what everybody I know watched last weekend. Right? So what 300 million strangers did last weekend is in some ways a more salient piece of information to me than what, the 200, 300 people that I know personally did is.
How about Facebook?
Well, okay, yeah, we can get to that in Q&A. And this is especially an issue with social search and everything like that. There may be performative technologies that are making this more salient than they used to be. And I kind of speculate about that in the conclusion of the book. But So it is about the structure, how information is structured to be salient. But traditionally, field-level summaries of information have been the most salient. We can imagine counterfactuals in which information of your particular alters is made more salient, although it's debatable. And actually, I still think that even under those conditions, you wouldn't see much of an effect for opinion leadership. And I'll explain why when I get into my simulations. Okay, so charts are really common, and they matter a lot, right? We have them in all sorts of things. It's very common to have bestseller lists. Not only the bestseller lists themselves, but also we have things like inventory practices are often based on bestseller lists. Let's say on my way back to LA, I'm bored, I want to read a book. So I go and get something at the airport bookstore. They don't have that many books there. They have maybe 200 titles. They're going to have the 200 bestsellers. So the fact that they're already bestsellers creates, preferential attachment. It's a cumulative advantage. And that's driven by how much they are. Now, like you mentioned, there's been some attempts to try and impose or facilitate greater salience for alter-based behavior with things like Facebook, Bing integration, and also Google+. Right? The entire reason Google created the Google+ social networking platform was so that they could get your social graph. They don't care if you actually use Google+, they just want you to name who your alters are. And then based on that, I'm not kidding. And based on that, they can have if they could have gotten access to Facebook's social graph, they never would have bothered with Google+. It's only because Facebook refused to export their graph data to Google that Google bothered creating Google+ to recreate the graph. So we have all these information to try and integrate people's social graph into ways of basically making information more salient as it's presented by alters. And so this may be changing a little, although I think not that much. Okay, so the real point is information is generally more accessible and salient. It may be changing, but definitely, at least traditionally, and I think even to a large extent going into the future, information is more salient and accessible at the field level than it is at the level of your own particular alters. Ironically, we may be more attuned to what people are doing in general than to what our own friends are doing. And similarly, there's often people who are trying to spread things exogenously, trying to promote ideas to a social system. So in a way, what I'm claiming is that Dodds and Watts weren't radical enough. They were saying that there's a certain structure of a network graph that's necessary for contagion to occur, for opinion leaders to be important, but they were still assuming that all diffusion occurs through cohesive contagion, through the graph. I'm saying, what if it doesn't happen through the graph? Or at least, what if it doesn't exclusively happen through the graph? You can learn about things from people you don't know, right? You can learn about things overall. You see advertisements. You come across things that are based on how popular they are in general. And so we need to problematize the basic assumption of cohesive contagion. Obviously, in some contexts, it's an appropriate one, especially for things that are highly sensitive or require a certain level of intimacy. But for many things, it's not an appropriate assumption. Furthermore, it's worth remembering that many diffusion processes aren't endogenous at all. Actors may be less attentive to either peers in general or social peers, specific peers than they are to other things that are exogenous to the social systems. So one of the great ironies of sociology is that people remember the tetracycline study as demonstrating that diffusion occurs through networks. It didn't actually show that. That was their argument. That was the conclusion. And they had network data and they had diffusion data, but they didn't actually convincingly show that the two were related. People will remember this from the study. What they should be remembering is this. And if you look at these curves, most of them are these concave shapes, which indicates that basically it was driven by Pfizer, not by the medical advice networks. And later secondary analysis of this has established, basically if people, instead of looking at the graph and being so wowed by the great network data they collected, just paid attention to the fact that this looked like this, we wouldn't have wasted 50 years as a discipline on a wild goose chase in the medical advice networks of small-town Illinois. So, now, similarly, we have this with radio. So radio is a profoundly bad fit for the opinion leader model, even though it has a favorable network structure, right? So it meets the scope conditions outlined by Watts and Strogatz, but it fails two additional scope conditions, which is it has important external influence in the form of record label marketing efforts, and it also has important endogenous field level dynamics in the form of pop charts. And rather than seeing this as something that's just about radio, I think this is actually something that is more generally true of many social systems, because you can see things. I mean, you don't have payola and you don't have Billboard magazine for most of the things we do, but we actually have things that look a little bit like payola and things that look a little bit like Billboard magazine in many areas. And so I think it may be more generalizable finding that we should be suspicious of cohesion arguments because we may have external influence structures and we may have field-level endogenous structures. And I want to show in simulation how this works in general and just how much of these you need in order to disrupt the opinion leadership effect. So following Watson-Strogatz, assume preferential attachment structure. Okay, they show that's a scope condition. Let's just accept that and move on. Let's not bother, trying to prove they were wrong and say that you can get it with a random graph. We're going to have a model where the node adopts as a probabilistic function of a constant labeled alpha, 1 beta for the rate overall who have adopted. This is the pop chart. This is like Billboard. And another beta for alters who have adopted, right? And then we're going to start with 100 nodes with an initial adopter selected at random. And we can play with this simulation in Q&A if you like. But right now I'm just going to show you the results. Okay. So first, if we do it with constant effect only, the confidence intervals show what happens when you do this simulation 500 times. We basically get the same thing every time. We have this, the red line is what you get on average. It's also what you'd predict just mathematically extrapolating it. The average matches perfectly the mathematical extrapolation. But the variation doesn't go too far off from what we'd expect. We get more or less the same thing every time. We get this classic Zeno's paradox function. Similarly, if we have generalized endogenous only, kind of a bestseller list effect, we get more or less the same thing. We pretty much always get an S-curve. Here's what's interesting. If we do cohesion only, that is, the only way you can learn about something is because you know somebody personally, right? One of your network alters who's done it. We get a tremendous amount of variation. Overall, it's still an S-curve. On average, it's still an S-curve. But basically, depending on when the hubs adopt, the hubs can form bottlenecks in the social system. And if just randomly it takes them a long time to key into the innovation, you can end up postponing the innovation. Conversely, if the innovation starts with the hubs, or it starts near the hubs and they adopt it quickly, you can have it spreading through the simulation, through the social system almost instantaneously, right? So you just get an enormous amount of variation. We can basically take the width of this confidence interval as reflecting the importance of the hubs. Now let's see what happens when we don't take the pure models, but we mix them together. This one is cohesion with a very small constant effect. That is, a very small marketing effect. You can see even a very small marketing effect is enough to completely disrupt the key power of the hubs. Similarly, this is cohesion with a very small generalized, like bestseller type effect. And the reason that, and again, you see that those confidence intervals tighten right up. And the reason is that the hubs no longer act as a bottleneck. Even if most of the time you learn about something through your friends, if you learn about things exclusively through your friends, that means that if there's one person who's at the core of the network, they can block the innovation. They can prevent it from spreading, and they can basically decide how quickly it spreads. But even if it only happens rarely, if it's possible, theoretically, on rare occasions, for it to just pop up at random points in the network because it's non-spatially determined, it can leapfrog over those bottlenecks. It can spread on the other side of the social system. It can basically get around them. It can spread on the other part of the social system. And then eventually that hub is going to be attacked from both sides. And because I'm modeling this as kind of a half-simple, half-complex contagion, the hub is eventually going to give into that, right? So as long as it can get around the hub, as long as the hub as long as it's not perfectly cohesive, right? As long as it's not perfectly a contagion thing, if there's any way around, it completely destroys the special power that we have for basically high bridging centrality nodes. They no longer serve as opinion leaders. If there's any way at all for the analysis to get around. So basically there's a scope condition that even if most of what's going on is direct person-to-person word of mouth, if there's any advertising effect or any bestseller list whatsoever, it can leapfrog those people and they no longer have the power to block innovations. Yeah?
Is there a little tweak you do on that? What advertising or promotion is doing is pressing the hubs to announce their preferences early, so they retain some of their image and centrality?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea, right? So this would be the idea. I mean, that's kind of a special case of viewing the network not as a pipe but a prism, right? And I've been playing around with that too, where I've been trying to say, what happens if there's a bestseller? Well, I guess that's a slightly different question. So I guess I haven't answered. Yeah, it's that would be another way that they wouldn't matter, right? Because it could look like they're mattering. I guess what you're saying is it could look like they're mattering even though they don't, right? They're giving into the inevitable rather than looking as if they're dragged in late.
But they could retain the image of spotting the next hit.
Yeah, so that would be consistent with it looking like a contagion effect. I mean, first of all, that's not happening in the simulation because I didn't program it to happen. I didn't program that kind of anticipatory adoption of the inevitable. You could add that in. So that could be yet another reason that it couldn't matter. The other thing that I've been playing with that I'm not showing here is if you imagine kind of a PageRank type model, which is when something gets adopted by the people who are popular, we make it more salient to everybody, right? You get things that look more or less like this, right? So we could think of those as ones where opinion leaders matter, but they don't matter in the way that only the people who are directly attentive matter. They matter in a way that once it basically, PageRank is not a pipes model. PageRank is a prisms model, right? It's using the network to inform how heavily to weight information in terms of presenting salience broadly overall. Yeah?
I'm just wondering, since the language of sort of bypassing bottlenecks got me thinking, if you took a preferential attachment graph
Yeah.
and randomly rewired a few of the connections,
Yeah.
would the confidence intervals collapse the same way? In other words, because it's almost as though you're describing a small world effect. Right?
Yeah, I haven't tried that, but I think that's basically what Watts showed.
But
Right? I think that's what they showed more or less in the JCR.
Right. And in a way, it's nice to say that they're analogous to any effect of exogenous influence is like you've
Yeah. Now, if
get
you
similar results.
now, I'm describing this. I'm describing the bestseller list as non-spatial. You can generalize if you really want to push it into a purely structured model. You can treat the bestseller list as a special case of everyone of a node that is linked to everybody with very low weight. Right. I mean, so you can subsume the generalized diffusion as a special case of contagion if you want to treat it as someone that's attached to everybody but with very low weight. And similarly, you could treat a constant hazard, kind of the external effect, as similar to that, but with slightly different assumptions.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to push it to a purely structural model.
Sure.
Maybe we could mistake the effects that we see in those models. Like, if we have random rewiring and any external influence, if they produce similar effects, we might mistake the effects of external or exogenous influence for being caused by random rewiring empirically.
It's possible. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, similarly going along, this is basically the same thing, just showing it a different way. Instead of the widths of the confidence interval, this is showing what is the advantage for the highly central nodes. So basically comparing the adoption times for the 5 most central people to the average person. And you can see when it's pure contagion, there's a big advantage. You add even small, getting into greater amounts of generalized effects, it goes away. Their advantage becomes very tiny. Similarly, with if it's generalized endogenous effects, that constant effect. Okay, so basically, I've identified these scope conditions for opinion leadership. The first one, which I'm carrying over from Watson-Strogatz, is that you need a preferential attachment network structure. Like I said, that doesn't particularly bother me. I think that preferential attachment structures or things that nearly approximate. We can debate as to how far away you can get from a preferential attachment structure and still see it. Right? It may very well be that you need a 100% pure preferential attachment structure with no rewiring in order to see. I haven't tested it to see how robust the structure is. If small deviations drive you away, maybe not. But you need a preferential attachment structure. Possibly something pretty close like it. Like I said, that doesn't bother me because those are actually pretty common. The other two things, which I think are actually much tougher problems for the hypothesis, are you need the complete absence of exogenous diffusion, that is advertising. Or at the very least, you need people to ignore advertising, right? So you need to either be that there is no advertising or there is advertising, but people completely ignore it. The second, and then the other scope condition I'm adding is the complete absence of generalized endogenous diffusion, things like bestseller lists, sales-dependent inventory, network externalities, etc. And I think these are actually much more challenging scope conditions for the opinion leadership hypothesis. In fact, so challenging that they basically falsify it. There's very few conditions under which all three of these conditions are met, which means to a first approximation, opinion leadership doesn't really exist. So, yeah. So that's it for the chapter. We can get into Q&A, and you guys can ask. If I have the song ready, if you guys want to hear it. I've got, and we can talk about. We can play with the simulation. We can talk about the rest of the book, whatever you guys like. Yes.
I'm curious, what do you think about Pandora Radio?
Yeah.
Where that might fall into?
Yeah. So questions about Pandora Radio. I don't think Pandora is that relevant to this particular thing. It is relevant to something else. So one of the effects you see is that genre is highly structured. So when I said that...
What was that?
When I said that songs look like this, that's true when a song is in its home genre. When a song is crossing over to a new genre, it actually does look like an S-curve. And more generally, I make an argument that genres are really important. So basically, the two things that are really important to getting a song to spread quickly, almost immediately, is it has to be a very good fit for the genre of the station. Basically, the programmer has to hear it, immediately say, yes, this is the kind of thing we do here, and then they'll put it on. And then the other is, like I said, it has to be promoted. Somebody has to give it to them. Somebody has to promote it. A record label has to promote it. But genre matters a lot, and I have a whole chapter on genre. The interesting thing about Pandora is that it doesn't have genre in the usual sense, and this is generally true of a lot of internet-based music. You see a similar thing with the iTunes Store. Increasingly, we're moving, with digital distribution, we're moving away from categorical conceptions of genre and more relational notions of similarity. Not even genre categories, right? Pandora, you don't listen to a rock's Pandora station. It says, what musician do you like? And then you say the Pixies, and then it plays the Pixies, and then it kind of snowball samples out to find artists who are somehow similar to the Pixies. And this is kind of a continuous relational conception of genre. Some of these schemas are based purely on collaborative filtering. That is to say, other people who like the Pixies also like this other band. Whereas others of them are based on musical... So Pandora in particular is based on musicological coding of the kind of inherent, things like tempo, how often does the singer scream, or whatever. And they find artists who are similar on those musicological characteristics, but it's very much a continuous conception. And what I think is interesting about that is that it implies a different set of notions about hybrid forms, right? So some of the work on categories, some of it coming out of this, I'm hesitant to say this department because somewhere on campus. I can never keep track of who's in GSB and who's in social. Somewhere on this campus, there's people working on genres and hybrid forms and the penalty for hybrid forms and stuff like that. But that's a much more meaningful concept if we actually have a categorical schema for genre. If we have just kind of a continuous relational concept for genre, it's not really clear that there is such a thing as a categorical imperative, like Zuckerman would describe. So I think that's actually going to be one of the big effects for Pandora. And more generally, the other thing about Pandora is that we're moving from a system of mass media, even narrowcasted mass media, where you might have 30 different differentiated forms of radio stations, to a system of mass customization, where my Pandora station is different from your Pandora station, and it's tailored individually to our taste. It's a profoundly different way, and it's not really clear how that will work. Yes?
So it seems to me your argument is about people adopting innovations,
yes.
New songs, new books, whatever. If you go back to Katz and Lazarsfeld in 1955, personal influence, they were not talking about that kind of market. They were talking about why women adopt different kinds of laundry detergents. And they claimed that their data showed, so this is where I think the two-step flow of communication argument was first developed fully. They claimed that what they found was that most women did not adopt based on what they heard from mass media, but they adopted based on on what these opinion leaders said.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm wondering is whether in a market where it's not, we don't have a constant flow of new items, instead we have a series of more or less established products, whether that might be, whether they were right, or whether if you had their data and analyzed it, whether you'd come out with something like this. It's a different kind of market and a different kind of adoption.
Yeah. So I want to be. I probably wasn't clear that. I get your question that you're kind of saying, like, might it be different when we're kind of like choosing between a fairly stable canon almost versus. Yeah, that's right. Where we've had the same laundry detergents for generations, right? As compared to one that's nonstop, constant novelty, right? The very things that attracted me to radio. Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure. In part because now the assumptions I'm using are premised on the idea. I'm using Bass model assumptions, right? So I'm assuming that you add and you never subtract, which is realistic on the short term, and it's realistic when you're dealing with constant novelty. It's not realistic over the long term. It's not realistic. There's no vacancy chain in this, right? I think that's a reasonable set of assumptions for radio. It's not necessarily a realistic set of assumptions for, like you said, laundry detergent or something like that. The other issue is I'm not claiming that cohesion never happens, right? I'm not saying that contagion through cohesive networks never happens. If you go back, if you go back to the simulation where I showed this sort of thing, most of what's going on there is cohesion, right? Most of the nodes in here are adopting because, nodes that are connected to them did it, right? So if you went and you interviewed these people and you say, why did you adopt widget, right? It's just a simulated innovation, but why did you become red? That's what I'm actually modeling. They'd say, well, because the turtle next to me adopted red. But the point here is not that people don't learn about things through their network alters. I think that's entirely possible, especially, now it's not like dish soap is necessarily something that's very intimate, but you could have other things that are intimate, right? I mean, the classic, that are sensitive, classic example being hybrid corn, right? Where all the farmers learned about hybrid corn from the seed company salesman, but none of them trusted the seed company salesman, so they wouldn't do it until their neighbors learned it. So you could have it be where people are learning about it from their alters, but the point is that the outsized power of people with high centrality goes away when it's possible to leapfrog them. That's all I'm claiming. It's entirely possible that you can still have contagion. And yes?
It is somewhat related to Mark's question. Have you or anybody else in this radio playlist looked at de-adoption? Because people adopt the song and then they quit playing it.
Yeah, so I did look at de-adoption in one case, but it was an unusual case. So I'll tell you what it is, but it wasn't at all representative. It was the Dixie Chicks thing.
There's something you can learn. Maybe the de-adoption process is different.
It is. First of all, it's a more complicated event, right? If I go from having never played a song to playing a song one time, in some meaningful sense, that counts as adoption. Whereas if I go from playing a song 80 times a week to playing it 10 times a week, have I de-adopted? Well, in some sense I have, in some sense I haven't.
Presumably the space between playing is decreased.
Yeah, that's right. That'd be another way to model it. But it's a harder event to define. But let's say that we agree on an operational definition, right? We say that less than 10 times a week counts as having dropped it. Or actually, they wouldn't say dropped it, they'd say downgraded it from a current to a recurrent, or downgraded it from a recurrent to a gold. Let's say we modeled that. The way that they do that, so I'm claiming in the book that the way people decide to start playing songs is basically they listen to it, it fits their genre conventions, and also that it's aggressively promoted by the record label. It's basically those two things that drive adoption decisions. What tends to drive abandonment, or at least downgrading decisions, is audience surveys. They do these surveys called call-out surveys, where they get a regular panel of listeners who have agreed to be a regular participant in the survey. Once a week, this person is supposed to call into a phone number. They get played a bunch of 10-second clips of songs, and then they do like a Likert scale for how they like the song on a scale 1 to 5. The number of people who strongly hate the song is called the burn rate. When the burn rate gets between 15 and 20%, the station stops playing it. So it is a different process, and it's one that's much more informed by consumer behavior or consumer preferences. So it's a totally different process. I haven't modeled it. The only time I did model abandonment is with the Dixie Chicks thing, but that's unusual. Most artists don't get off the radio because they're politically blacklisted. You know.
I just thought that maybe that's when they paid attention to whether the KISS station or the other station.
Yeah, it's possible that you could have different outcomes. Yeah.
They're not playing a time to.
Yeah,
to
it's
kill it.
Yeah, it's entirely possible, and it's something I could check. It's a little bit harder to get out of data. It's not the way the queries are set up, but you could force the data to do that and look at that kind of outcome. But I just haven't done it yet. Yeah, Amir. Yeah.
So I was wondering, all the simulations and the diffusion that you show us eventually reach some sort of level of saturation. But of course, most songs, even though that they're promoted by record labels, don't make it.
That's right.
Or make it only slightly lower than the threshold of the average. So I'm wondering how I think the only model in which there's a large kind of confidence intervals is the one that's based on cohesion only, in which you see some songs that don't take off at all, right?
Well, the assumption of that model, because I'm using Bass model assumptions, the assumption is that if I allowed that to run an infinite number of iterations, eventually it would reach saturation. So even in that, even though it looks like it's staying at 0 and the lower bound, that's only because I'm allowing it to run for a finite number of iterations. If I let the model run infinite number of iterations, it would eventually saturate. That's obviously stupid, right?
The question is, given that we know that not all songs reach saturation, and your kind of provocative argument about opinion leadership not existing, then what piece is missing in our model, and does that still fit with your conclusion?
Yeah, it's a good question. Partly this is driven by the kind of, you can't study something that didn't happen, right? You can't study the counterfactual, and as we know from that simulation that Denrell and Kovacs did in ASQ a few years ago, that's actually an important bias. I wasn't looking at which songs succeed and which ones fail. I was looking at different routes of success, right? Not which ones succeed and which ones fail. Because I didn't model that, I can't tell you definitively. My expectation is that it would be a function of genre conventions and record label promotional effort. And then in addition to that,
some feedback from
and then there's probably going to be some feedback based on the chart or something like that. Now, what you do see, I think, is if a song fits with genre conventions and it's aggressively promoted by its record label, very often you will have a lot of stations play it. They just won't ever put it into heavy rotation. So again, this is kind of like the previous question of it's a matter of changing the dependent variable. It's a matter of changing the outcome. I'm mostly just looking at when does a station play it a first time. I don't model when they start playing it 80 times a week so that every time you turn on your car radio you hear the same song. That's a different outcome and a much more interesting outcome if you're trying to sell records. But I don't model it. So, yeah.
I buy the story about how the relational dynamics of these radio stations affect adoption rates overall.
Or don't.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
and I understand what you're trying to portray with the simulations, but they seem to be kind of net of the content of what's being diffused. You can imagine that certain songs are just simply more appealing, if you can measure that, or more provocative, for example, on a number of different dimensions. So I'm wondering how much of the variation in adoption is simply due to the kind of songs we play.
Yeah, so the closest I can get to answering that is not from my work, but from Solganik, where Solganik did this experiment where he wasn't looking at professional radio programmers, he was just looking at ordinary people, basically a convenient sample of teenagers. And he played a bunch of different songs to them, and in some conditions they just heard the songs and that was the only information they had. And he used their ratings under that condition as his operational measure of quality. And then he also had 6 independent conditions where they saw independently maintained download counts. So there were download counts, but it was kind of like alternate parallel universes. And then he did a few variations more on that. And what he found was that there was one song that was always in the top half, but it could be anywhere in the top half in the alternate universes, and there were 2 songs that were always in the bottom half, but they could be anywhere in the bottom half, right? They could be absolute floor, or they could be just below the median. And then all the other songs, the other 46 songs I think it was, could be anywhere in the distribution. They could be very close to the top. They could be very close to the bottom. And what Solganic drew from that, and I think he interpreted it correctly, is that quality doesn't matter nearly as much as we think it does. And quality not just in the sense of good, bad, but any kind of intrinsic coding, right? Anything that you can code doesn't matter nearly as much as we think it does. It's heavily, heavily stochastic. And second of all, that to the extent that it does matter, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition, right? Where you can, in order to be very successful, you probably need to be at least minimally decent quality. But on top of that, it's stochastic. And this is why it's so hard to be a record executive or a... And he didn't put this in the article, but some of you may have read the Gladwell article, The Formula, where he talks about these like data mining type guys who like figure out all sorts of things that can go into a screenplay, and they claim they can, or at least in Gladwell's presentation of it, they claim they can predict which screenplays are going to be hits. And then also a similar organization, Something Blue, that claims that they can predict which pop songs are going to be hits. Solganic told me that he talked to those people and they said that they can claim which ones won't be hits, but they can't determine definitively which ones will be hits, right? They can determine which ones have the potential to be hits, but on top of that, it's stochastic. And I think from his experimental evidence with the Music Lab, the MP3 website, that's the best you can do, right? There are inherent limits to how much you can do, given that there's this heavy stochastic element. Yeah?
I was curious about some of your other, so the simulation doesn't really square up with the description of the practitioners in the field. And
that's right.
And I wonder if your book talks about this, because it's curious to me why you have musicians that think that making on this radio is fundamental. You interview the radio station owners, and they say, oh, we listen to the New York. And then the simulation indicates differently. So,
yeah, I just, when in doubt, you know, if you have to choose between the accounts of participants and the self-descriptions of their accounts and what you actually see in the data, I say go with the data. Right, I think there's all sorts of cultural scripts that are decoupled from behavior. Right, so my favorite example of this is St. Augustine, who claims that he became a Christian after overhearing some neighboring children saying "Tolle lege, tolle lege," and he picks up St. Paul's letters and reads them, and then he falls down crying and becomes a Christian. I think the reason he did that is because St. Paul had a conversion moment on the road to Damascus, right? So there was this cultural script within Christianity that said that the way you become a Christian is you have an epiphany from God. And especially with Augustine's own theology of irresistible grace, he felt like it had to be that way. I think more realistically, it was all about Monica and Ambrose, right? His mother and his best friend were Christians, and he'd been thinking about it for 20 years, you know. And now maybe hearing these neighbor children say, take it and read, was like the straw that broke the camel's back. But realistically, I think we can say it was all Monica and Ambrose who converted Augustine to Christianity. Yet nonetheless, he feels the need to emphasize this thing because there's a cultural script about the moment of epiphany and the grace of God. So similarly, I just think there's all sorts of areas where people will tell you things because they think it's the appropriate culturally prescribed way that things are supposed to go. Also, there's a certain amount of acquiescence bias, right? I didn't ask people, do you pay attention to any of your alters? There's a certain amount of social desirability bias and acquiescence bias. When I ask, when an interviewer says, what other stations do you pay attention to? You know, it seems a little bit weird to say, I don't pay attention to any other stations. Some of them did, but the vast majority of them came up with somebody, right? In the same kind of way where if I were to ask you, what journals did you read cover to cover last week? You're probably going to say ASR or something like that. You're not going to say, well, I have to admit that the last couple of months I just throw it in the trash, right?
Sarah Palin, what magazine?
Yeah.
So, all of them.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I mean, some of us are better at following the cultural scripts than others, right, and articulating them. But I basically, when in doubt, I say go with the data, and it doesn't bother me too much that it contradicts what the field participants say. Yeah.
Well, I guess following up on that question, it seems like it's unclear what the contradiction is, eventually, if one is undermining the other. Because when the performer says, oh, we want to get on K-Rock, that actually might be important, but because that's not what you're talking about is how radio stations decide.
No. He's specifically saying, he's not saying Los Angeles is a big rock market. He's not saying if we get on K-Rock, every person who likes rock music in Los Angeles will hear us on K-Rock and buy our record. He's saying other radio programmers elsewhere in the country are attentive to what K-Rock does, and that's going to get us on radio throughout the country, not just in Los Angeles.
Well,
yeah.
Well, I guess the question.
Yeah, it could be a low-value source. Yes.
Do you have a sense of actually how the diffusion process actually might work differently? Because you can imagine for me as an individual consumer of music, K-Rock actually is the sort of important gatekeeper.
Well, if you live in LA, yeah.
Yeah, and so or any radio station, right? The way I make decisions about music is sort of different than how radio programmers decide what to play, and those two things aren't completely independent of one another, obviously.
Yeah, that's right. So I, at the beginning of the book, let's see if I can pull it up real fast. I'm basically working from Hirsch's model. That there's a multi-stage diffusion model that where is this? Yeah. So I'm working from Hirsch's multi-stage diffusion model, where you start with a pool of original artists, right? Basically a bunch of garage bands that are hoping to get signed. Some of them get signed with cultural distributors. So some of these garage bands get record deals. Most of them don't, right? Of those that get record deals, some of them get picked up by radio stations. Most of them don't. Of those that get, or what Hirsch calls more generally surrogate consumers, of those who get picked up by radio stations, some of them become hits with the mass audience. Most of them don't. So it's a series of progressive winnowing at each stage of the gatekeeper. Now, some of these are diffusion processes, right? Some of these are a one-to-many thing, right? So from the record label is trying to get many radio stations to play the song. So there's a one-to-many process. You can meaningfully describe this as a diffusion process. Similarly, the radio station is playing the song to many listeners. You can meaningfully say that there's a diffusion process emanating from the radio station to the listener. And then, of course, the listeners may be learning about it from their friends. It's not that that's the only source of information they get, but it's one source of information. Others of these are one-to-one, right? So you only get one record deal at any given time. You don't get multiple record deals at any given time. So, some of these, in some ways, the process you're asking about, radio station to consumer, is analogous to the record label to a radio station way. In other ways, it's different, right? And I think that there probably is more peer-to-peer type of action among listeners. If I think of back when I was really into music, when I was in high school or whatever, I was as likely to learn about things from my friends, let me borrow their CDs or whatever, as I was to learn about things by listening to, as it happens, K-Rock, because I grew up in LA. Yeah.
Two things. One, you did mention something that you talked about in your earlier work, which is corporate ownership of radio stations.
Yeah.
That's a different form of control, unlike advertising, but the fact that many of these stations are owned by the same company.
Yeah.
And I take it you've just assumed, or you've shown that that's not hugely important.
Yeah. So that's that's chapter 2.
Okay.
So I actually had a grant reviewer once tell me there was no point in studying radio stations because all the decisions are made at the corporate level. So I'm bitter about this.
I don't know if your Sloan grant, the economists like that.
Yeah, well, they approved me. That peer reviewer who was saying there's no point in studying stations because it's all made at the corporate level seemed to have in mind, if you extrapolate out, what the implications of what they were saying, it implies that the diffusion curve should look something like this, where let's say that corporate headquarters in Clear Channel corporate headquarters sends out a fax saying, everybody play My Humps. Clear Channel's curve would look like this. It would be a step function. And then on a slightly different day, the head programmer at CBS corporate headquarters says, everybody play My Humps. And then you have another step function. And then, Citadel or Cumulus or whatever the other stations are. So basically you have a series of step functions, each of which would be extremely steep, basically step function, and each of which would be offset from each other at the corporate level. It turns out that you don't see that. Basically, each of them has the same smooth function and they're simultaneous with each other. So
it's set above the corporate level.
One of my book peer reviewers said that, and I'm like, there's just I didn't go. The conspiracy doesn't go high enough, right? So you're not thinking big enough, right? It's just there's just no arguing with some people. And basically, you see a series of they're basically simultaneous. They all follow the same shape, and this is because they're driven by. The reason that you have the shape is because they're driven by the record labels. But the reason that they're not offset from each other and they're not step functions is because the decisions are made in the room. They're made in the room as heavily influenced by the record label, but they're not made at corporate headquarters and sent out. And then I also do this with, I do some fancier math than this. I'm not just eyeballing the graphs. I do it and I try and set it up more favorably. And I do a bunch of survival analysis with shared frailty, and there's no shared frailty clustered at the corporate level. So, so basically, there's no matter how hard I try to be favorable to the corporation matters hypothesis, it doesn't matter for day-to-day behavior. It does matter for format flipping. I trust Henrik Grieve on that, but I don't think it matters at all for day-to-day decision making.
Well, last chapter question: how much of your analysis is contingent on the character of top 40 radio? How generalizable are these assumptions to genres where there's much more novelty, say, than top 40? Almost all of your examples are of established stars, rather than new to the world artists.
Yeah, so, yeah.
I had a general question about what do you think about more radical innovations, right? Because your very definition, anything is an innovation. Any new song, by definition, is an innovation.
Yeah.
And what about more radical innovations, including innovations that create new genres?
That's chapter 6.
Okay. I'm
glad. So, chapter 6 all about genre. And actually, I got almost exactly the same criticism from my wife, and that's why I wrote chapter 6. So, she was like, you call these things innovations, but they're so trivial. It's not an innovation for a radio station to play a song. That's just what they do. Anyway, so here's a case of a song that happens to be a love song by Sarah Bareilles. And you can see that on its initial format, it has that same concave function we're now used to, but when it crosses over to other formats, it has an S-curve. So basically, when something isn't that good of a genre fit, people do need affirmation from their peers. Not necessarily the people they particularly know, but at least people in their field, as summarized by the pop chart. And then we can say, well, this is a crossover, but it is an AC song, right? It is, a hot AC song. This is a song that does have a home genre. What about a song that doesn't have a home genre, because it's a home format? Because it's a new format. It's just a radically new type of music that nobody's ever heard before. And so for that, I did this analysis of reggaeton, which in 2004 nobody had heard it, outside of Puerto Rico. And what you see there is that it also spreads by S-curves for the early songs. The early songs spread by S-curves. And then at a certain point, it became institutionalized. Okay, then we see the spread of reggaeton. This is the percent of airplay taken up by reggaeton for non-Mexican regional Latin stations. So basically, if it's in Spanish, but it's not Mexican cowboy music, it increased like this. So by the peak of its popularity, it was 1/4 of all non-Mexican regional Spanish language radio. And it had a little bit of airplay in hip-hop, but it never got that much in hip-hop radio. And then, by the time that happened, you start seeing concave curves, right? So over we see as we see new genres emerge, there's a learning process during which they become institutionalized in radio. And until they become institutionalized, they have a very difficult time getting airplay, and they basically require peer affirmation among the radio stations at the song level. But eventually, it just becomes a regular part of the programming mix. It becomes institutionalized, and they start playing it more regularly.
So when something really strange comes out there, then the leadership hypothesis, opinion leadership.
Well, it's not necessarily opinion leadership, right? It's not necessarily that the hubs have to start playing it. It might very well just be that some random station plays it, and that puts it a little bit higher on the chart, and then some other station nobody's ever heard of plays it, right? It could be that it's all going through the chart, right? So it is endogenous. It's just not. It just doesn't. You can have endogenous processes that don't go through the graph.
How did the radio? How did they actually? Did you ask them? How do you decide what to play? Like when you
Well, but as previously discussed, who cares what they say because it's not reliable. They say that they listen to it, that they pay a lot of attention to the chart. Most of them claim that they're more attentive to the chart and to their peer stations than they are to the record. Actually, I didn't even ask them about the record companies because it's too sensitive of an issue. At the time I was doing this study, there had just been a major scandal over payola, so I figured that I didn't even want to ask that lest I get... But none of them volunteered that information, let's put it that way. And in the qualitative interviews I did, where I did ask them about that, they're like, oh yeah, we get advice from the record label sometimes, but it's not that big a deal, and we try and shoo them out of our office, and they're kind of a nuisance. Same way that like a congressman might tell you about how they deal with lobbyists or something. It's like, yeah, I don't get that much information, right? The congressman's not going to tell you, oh yeah, I take this model legislation and I just implement it. I just sign my name to it.
So do you have a sense of how important the payola side of this is relative
it's huge.
to just the advertising?
Well, yeah, it's hard to say because payola is kind of a continuum, and also it's very difficult to study something that's illegal and therefore surreptitious. One way that you can, there's definitely promotion is important. Record label promotion is important, and it seems like payola is a big part of that. And it's hard to say whether payola is most of it or part of it. In the qualitative interviews and some of the other evidence, it seems like full-blown naked payola is fairly rare, but not unheard of. There was just a scandal in 2005 over it. But it seems like it's actually gotten much more subtle. In the 80s, payola was controlled by the mob, and it was really, really corrupt and really, really naked. Whereas nowadays, they tend not to do payola. They tend to do these kind of like gift exchange type practices where it's like, let's say I'm a record label and you're a radio station. I'll say, hey, do you need any help with concert tickets to give to your listeners? It's like the fifth caller gets concert. Can I help you out with that? And the next day I might say, hey, can you help me out with, I'm trying to get some airplay for the song. I think you might like it. I really like this song, and I'm just hoping, maybe your station will like it too. Right? So it's this subtle, like, gift exchange type thing. I actually have a theory piece I just finished talking about this, that when I hadn't planned on writing theory pieces. I don't think of myself as a theorist generally, but I was reading through all these legal court records about payola, and I just noticed this, and it was too cool not to write up. So in addition to writing in the book, I also wrote up this theory piece talking about how when you have a sketchy exchange, something that strikes people as immoral or unsavory or something like that, they're not going to have it as a cash on the barrel head quid pro quo. They're going to try and structure it in some more subtle, almost patrimonial type fashion, so it feels a little bit less sketchy to them. And you've seen that in the last few years with payola. There's the ironic fact is that in the 80s, when payola was more of a straightforward cash quid pro quo, we saw that as sketchy and immoral, whereas now where it's like almost this patrimonial gift exchange type thing, we see that as very professional, right? Which seems kind of backwards, right? Usually we think of patrimonialism as backwards, and cash quid pro quos as modern and rational. But because it's an illegitimate exchange, we view it the opposite.
That's interesting. All right, well, it's a great point to drop on. Thank you very much.